between when the president spoke and when I'm speaking, because you don't want to follow a pastor and all his oratory, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of more of the practical things, not more of the worldly things than the eternal things that he was discussing. Today I'm going to talk about, it's listed in the program, the church shootings and hate crimes against places of worship. But, I want to put it in a broader context. It's all part of religious freedom and religious liberty. George Washington, in his famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, talked about how all are welcome in America, and he said, in the laws of America, we ensure that everyone shall be able to sit under his own fig and his own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. So he's really he's talking about persecution and religious liberty, but at the root of it is that basic right to worship in peace, to go out in public and carry your faith with you and not be afraid of being physically attacked. That peace is the most fundamental form of religious liberty, and Washington recognized that. But I also want to talk about more broadly, since you're covering a range of issues today, I want to start by just sort of laying out the framework of the different areas where the federal government and the Department of Justice is involved in the area of protecting religious liberty. And a major component of that is protecting from active shooter, but also arsons, threats, other forms of violence, which I'll describe. And they're all tied to our civil rights laws more broadly, and we'll see that as we go along. But so just to start, we are going to, there we go. First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Government may not take over the religious sphere. This was very important to Baptists, especially in the early days when you had the established church and the Anglican church, and Baptist preachers were tarred and feathered and driven from towns. And then or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's one area where we've seen, and I'll show in a minute, a lot of more activity in recent years. The Supreme Court has become increasingly concerned with the free exercise of religion. So the Attorney General issued guidelines in 2017. President Trump had announced at the National Day of Prayer in May 2017 that he was ordering the Attorney General to do this. And so the Attorney General came down with 20 principles, and it's a great document. It's up on the Civil Rights Division webpage, Department of Justice. You can just Google the title, and you should pull it up. It's written for a non-lawyer, that anyone should be able to read this and walk away understanding what the general legal protections are. It also has a more detailed appendix with case citations and things that might be more for the lawyer. But there are three basic areas it covers under this free exercise of religion. So equal treatment, the idea that people of faith and faith-based institutions should be treated equally with non-religious entities. So Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia, that was a recent case that said that if you're going to have a program where you're giving shredded recycled tires for playground surfacing, you can't give it to everybody and then say, oh, but no church nursery schools can apply. Because there's nothing religious about shredded rubber tires. Anyone can, any child will benefit if they fall. So you shouldn't discriminate against churches. And this is also present in the school choice cases. We were involved this year in a Supreme Court case that's now pending, Espinosa, deciding whether school choice funds, if they go to, Montana gives has a plan to give money that parents can use for the school of their choice, they can't exclude religious schools. If they allow all private schools except religious schools, that's discrimination against religion. It's not government advancing religion if a parent chooses religious school, but it's left to the parent's choice, and it's discrimination if they're forbidden to do so. Hostility towards religion, that came up in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case about the wedding baker, the wedding cake baker. We thought maybe they were going to decide the case a little more broadly, on some other principles. They ended up focusing on animus, that they had shown animus towards this Christian baker, and decided on that grounds. Autonomy. So there are a lot of cases now involving the institutional autonomy, the ability of a church or place of worship to, for example, hire ministers without second guessing by the government, so that the Catholic Church can hire male priests, or a church can decide that everybody working here should be a member of this faith group. Supreme Court's deciding that right now in a case involving Catholic school teachers, and whether those shall be considered ministry positions, which the school is free to hire and fire as they please. Couple recent cases that we're working on, Payne Elliott versus Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Indiana. That's a case where you have a gay married teacher who was discharged from his job as a teacher at a school. He didn't sue the school, though. What he's done is he's sued the archdiocese, because the archdiocese told the school, hey, if you want to remain a Catholic institution, you can't have a teacher who's involved in a same-sex marriage. We're not telling you you have to, but to remain within the ambit of the Catholic Church, that's what you need to do. They were sued as a result. We said, no, that's an autonomy decision, that it's up to the church to decide, not the government, and thus, so we weighed in that case. Business Leaders in Christ versus University of Iowa. That's a case involving students who formed a Christian ministry group on campus. They do not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. It's one of the requirements of student clubs that you don't. But they do say that if you are a member, however, whatever your orientation, you must ascribe by the beliefs of the group. And that includes no sex outside of marriage, marriage between a man and a woman. They were decertified as a student group by the school and sued. We weighed in saying, no, they have the right to express themselves in terms of how they associate as part of their free exercise of religion and their First Amendment free expression. And we ended up winning that case. Adoption cases. So Supreme Court just Monday granted in a case deciding whether faith-based adoption agencies can, like the Catholic ones in this case, or other Christian ones, can decide that they'll only place children with a mother and a father. They won't place kids with same-sex parents. Philadelphia had said, no, everybody has to. And the interesting thing in a lot of these cases is there are usually plenty of, any given state, you deal with, 60, 70. I know in Michigan, we looked at like 140 adoption agencies. Many of them would work with same-sex couples. So there were plenty of places where folks could go. But people have sued saying, no, every single one of the agencies, including all the faith-based ones, must deal with everybody. So we'll see where that goes. The United States hasn't taken a position in that particular case, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Finally, Faith and Opportunity Initiative. Last year, 2018, President Trump issued a new executive order on the faith-based initiative. That was started by President Bush, and then President Obama re-upped it, and then President Trump has made some slight modifications to it. It's the idea that religious organizations should be able to compete for federal funding along with other agencies. The idea is, if someone's giving a service like homeless shelter, now it doesn't matter if it's a Christian group giving the shelter or someone else. The people are getting the shelter. If the government is paying for shelter, as long as that's being provided, it shouldn't matter who it's being provided by. And there are two forms of aid. So there's direct aid where the government's saying, okay, we want this money to go to this particular purpose, and we're going to give the money to the homeless shelter. If that's the case, it can't be religious. And the group, and here, this is the next thing, the Christian group needs to separate the ministry part from the federally funded service. So if you're doing a shelter, you can have the shelter, but if you're going to have a Bible study, you have to have that in a separate place. So you're not required to be present for the Bible study. You can announce it and say all are welcome, but you can't discriminate against people, like only admit the people who are going to join the Bible study and so forth. And that's when it's direct aid. And then there's something called indirect aid. It's kind of like school vouchers, where if someone's given a job training voucher by the government that they can go and use for the job training program of their choice, then Christian ministries can make the program as religious as they want to, because it's an individual choosing to go to that ministry. And so the federal funds are used, but only through the choice of the individual. So there's a lot more leeway there. And President Trump's order has clarified some of these points. 9 different agencies have issued rules that are going to be finalized soon, sort of laying these all out. And I'd be happy to talk to folks afterwards about any of the details on this. With a lot of these things, I'm going through a lot of material. I really just want to sort of expose you to it. You don't need to learn it and understand everything I'm saying, but just to sort of hit on the different areas of issues that are out there, of federal resources that are out there, and hopefully lead you to ask questions or explore more today, or looking stuff up after. So preventing violence against places of worship. This is an increasing problem, unfortunately. Unfortunately, you go back to Columbine with schools. School shootings became a thing, right? So it became a mode by which somebody who was disaffected wanted to get back at society. So you had students going out and committing copycat crimes like Columbine. Unfortunately, with churches, we're starting to see the same sort of thing, that you have people who seize on this model of, I will attack a church, I will attack a synagogue, and so forth. And so it's something we need to be vigilant about. It affects many different people. So Eugene, Oregon, we had these were swastika-covered rocks thrown through a synagogue. There's a prayer rug at a Toledo mosque that was someone tried to set fire to, and then a Wisconsin African-American church that was threatened with violence. And I'll get into some more specifics as we go along. But these the federal laws against attacks on places of worship have their roots in the Civil Rights Act, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which President Johnson is signing there. The first criminal law they passed was interference with a federally protected right. So if you had a federally protected right, like the right to vote, the right to employment, the right to use a lunch counter, things like that, the law also said it's a crime to interfere with somebody's right to exercise their basic civil rights. And we've used these in religious cases, like this case from California. You might have remembered this 1999 Jewish Community Center case in Los Angeles. Well, at the time, we didn't have a lot of, we didn't have the same hate crime laws that we have today, which I'll explore in a minute, but we did have, he killed a security guard. So we said he interfered with his employment. And that goes back to the civil rights era, and you can't interfere with somebody's right to employment. And so we were able to prosecute him with that. Same thing with the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act prevents discrimination in housing, but also prohibits violence by neighbors to drive people away from exercising their fair housing rights. There's a Ku Klux Klan rally there, which often, burning a cross is a sign to scare African American families from a neighborhood, and so we prosecute these cases under that. Generally, they're race cases, but they also can be religion cases. Like here is a apartment complex with a mosque attached in Kansas. Last year, we were able to sentence 3 men who to 25 to 30 years in prison each for plotting to bomb the facility, even going so far as to take a inert decoy bomb from the FBI that they planned to plant there to carry this out. But we were able to use this fair housing law to prosecute it. Then in the 1990s, the Congress, in response to a rash of church arsons, largely at African American churches in the South and rural areas, turns out more than half of them were carried out by a Satanist. But at the time, we were seeing this as a growing problem. They passed the Church Arson Prevention Act, which not only prevents church arson, but any violent interference with religious exercise or threats to do so. And so here's a case. It doesn't have to be arson. Someone drove a truck into the front of a mosque after 9/11. We prosecuted that under the Church Arson Prevention Act. Then in 2009, Congress passed the Shepard-Byrd Act. It was most famous because it expanded the hate crime categories to include sexual orientation and gender identity. But one of the things from a prosecutor's standpoint that it did was eliminate the requirement that we prove that someone interfered with someone's religious exercise or interfered with a civil rights law like fair housing. All we have to prove now is that someone was attacked, and they were attacked because of their race, their religion, their national origin, their gender identity. So if you have that, the violence plus that motivation, that's enough to prosecute under that statute. It does not cover threats, however. So the other statutes all become important if your church receives a threat. We can't prosecute it under this law, but we can prosecute it under the other laws I mentioned. So the Dylan Roof case was a famous case in 2015 in Charleston, where the man came into a Bible study, sat for the whole Bible study, and then at the end shot the African-American pastor and parishioners who were there. We charged and convicted under both the Church Arson Prevention Act, the violent interference with religious exercise, and this Shepard-Byrd Act, the attacking them because of their race. In that case, if it was another case, we might have done because of their religion, but because they're African-American, we were able to do it because of their race, and that was sort of a clear motivation in that case. Case from Poway, California, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This was the attack on the synagogue there. Again, we charged this under both 247, the Church Arson Prevention Act, and 249, the Shepard-Byrd Act, 54 counts of each. What's notable in this case is we also charged him with plotting to attack a mosque, an attempted arson, the month before, in March of last year. And the fact that this is something we see frequently is it's not in America where you have like one group against another, one religious group attacking another religious group. It tends to be one person who doesn't like Muslims and they don't like Jews, and it's generally someone who has a racist ideology or something who's attacking people of different faiths. This graph just shows hate crimes against Jews in the U.S. Jews continue to be the most victimized group in hate crimes, substantially more than any other group. And you can see sort of the trend line. We had a sort of a sharp rise, 2017. That was partly because of one person doing a lot of these threats. But then still in 2018, we saw a drop. That 2018 figure would include the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Tree of Life Synagogue, though that's only counted as one, so that wouldn't account for all those numbers. So that's a troubling number. Anti-Muslim hate crimes, big rise after 9/11, then came down a little. We had a spike here in 2015, but that's the trend is better there than we see in the Jewish community. So what are we doing about all this? So we're putting on programs for protecting places of worship, and this is something I encourage you to reach out to me, reach out to your local FBI, your local U.S. attorney's offices. A lot of churches may not have relationships with the U.S. attorney's office or the FBI. I would be happy to put you in touch with them. You can also reach out, on your own. They're very happy to hear from you. One thing, I worked a lot talking to the Muslim community after 9/11 when they were having a lot of these hate crimes and things, and I always said the last thing you want to do is sort of have that first call to the FBI when something's happened, because they don't know you, they don't know your building. If you have the law enforcement come and visit you, you have a relationship, at least, the first responders know the lay of your building. They've been there before. They know you. They know who to call. They know who the assistant pastor is, and so forth. It's good to have those relationships in place. But, one of the things the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI do is put on these programs for protecting places of worship. We have them with there's the Community Relations Service, CRS, from DOJ, and they have a staff that's putting these on around the country. We've done them from the Civil Rights Division in conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office and with the FBI. And they really cover the basic things that you want to know about as the leader of a church. So the idea is we might get a room about this size and have people from diverse faiths, or if it's a bigger church, you might have an executive director who kind of runs operations and things. But just get sort of the practical information out to people. What are the risks? What are some basic things you can do? For example, Homeland Security, what we do in these programs, we bring in someone from FBI, someone from Homeland Security, like Protective Security Advisor. These are folks who are in every state. Some states have 4 and 5 of them. I think California probably has more than that. And they go around to critical infrastructure, dams and electrical power plants and things, and places of worship, places that are vulnerable. And they'll do a walkthrough. My church did it. We had a guy come in and he walked through and we talked about cameras, talked about what doors are open during a service, just sort of simple things. How do you become welcome? How do you stay welcoming while still having people at key entry and exit points? What's your plan for communications, walkie-talkies? Do you have a policeman out front? Do you have people parking? Do they have walkie-talkies to communicate with people inside? How would you call 911? What's your plan if something were to happen? Those are the types of things that they walk you through. And then there's certain grants that are available through Homeland Security for hardening infrastructure and hardening places of worship, things like cameras and so forth. Then FBI will talk about active shooter. And here's another, so FBI has some resources. They'll talk about characteristics of active shooters. I'm not an expert on it myself, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but a lot of interesting information, like somebody who, what are the characteristics of these people? Generally, they're not crazy in a sense that they have a identifiable psychosis or mental illness. To the extent that there are mental illnesses, it's generally anxiety and depression, and generally not higher rates than the general population. So that's kind of scary, but then there are factors you can look for, such as a high sense of self-esteem. You have people who have an overly developed ego and a sense of grievance. There's one active shooter who saw himself as very handsome and suave and couldn't understand why women didn't like him, and therefore he had this sense of grievance against women and didn't attack against a sorority house. People with churches, they might feel that they were aggrieved in some way and they deserve more in life. And so that kind of entitlement personality. And they also tell you things like how these people, since they're going to do this and know they're probably going to die, they often think about it for a long period of time, 9 months, even a year, that they sort of think through what they're going to do and fantasize about it. But then when they go operational, it's often like a week to 10 days. So if you got someone casing your church in the parking lot, you want to take notice, because if it is someone who's becoming operational for a shooting, they're probably acting very quickly. Once they acquire the arms, do the surveillance, they're moving. So things like that it's good to have an expert. Again, I'm not an expert on this operational side of things. I just have been to enough of these that I picked up some from the FBI. But to have them come in and do a presentation for you, answer your questions, have someone from Homeland Security answering your questions about hardening infrastructure, having people to talk about, do you have armed people in your church or not? Do you hire armed people? Do you have parishioners armed? All very difficult questions. Very complicated. I mean, one of the things the FBI will tell you is that in half the church active shooters, the event has been stopped by a civilian before the police arrived. Now, it's not always an armed civilian. That's important to know. I mean, sometimes it's, as in the POA, someone charging at him when his gun jammed and the guy runs the other way, or people throwing things at them and they run. Sometimes it's someone from outside, like in Texas, where you had someone heard the shooting, got his gun, came and took out the shooter. So, and then you have the situation that you saw recently where you did have a church that was with people positioned and they were able to take down the shooter. All very difficult issues. They're both tactical and spiritual issues. As I was saying to the president just this morning, I mean, I've talked to churches where, they get a dozen men from the church and they drill every month. And, they're drilling, which is good, right? But then what else could they be doing? What's the opportunity cost? Are these men who aren't doing a Bible study because they're drilling and thinking about violence and protecting the church all the time for something that's going to be a 1 in 500,000 plus event? Very difficult issues that a church needs to think through. How do you balance safety and security? My church, I'll just throw an example. We've trained our elders, our deacons, our professional staff, our parking people, and our ushers and in all this stuff. And we've shown them the films about active shooters. We haven't shown it to the general. We've got about 2,000 people. We don't want everybody freaking out over this because we don't think it's at that level like with kids with a fire drill at school where everybody needs to know what to do. And that's a deliberate decision. It would be more effective if we had everybody watching the active shooter videos and things, but we made a determination, no, we think we can cover it with these people knowing what to do and going forward. But again, having a seminar like what I'm describing with several hours of different speakers coming in, and then we'll have often a panel. We'll have some people who've either experienced this or had disputes in their congregation about how to deal with this, and they're talking about their experience. Or I remember one we did in Iowa, and someone was just talking about sort of the street crime issues they had and what they did to interfere with that, because that's all part of the same piece. How do you stay welcoming, but then prevent violence from a street, flowing into the place of worship? So again, I encourage you all to go online. You can find these FBI resources or these at the Community Relations Service, or my information will be at the end. And then there's this great page that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, puts out, the FEMA resource page on all the different government resources that are available. So some of the things I've mentioned, some other things that are out there, even like webinars you can watch on protecting places of worship. All these kinds of things that unfortunately we don't want to deal with, but the way things have gone in our society in the last 20 years, it's something that I think we do need to think through. So these are, there's my, so take down my information. If you don't remember it, it's just eric.treene@usdoj.gov. And there are websites with our resources page, and I'll leave that up for a minute. Bob, how are we doing on time? Because I want to go on to RLUIPA. We good? Yeah, okay. Since I have an audience of pastors, and we've talked about some of this, we'll open for questions because Bob is going to speak after me, and there should be some time before lunch when we can open it up for questions on anything we've talked about. And but I just want to throw out for you information about the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, because it's not a law that gets the headlines like some of these conflicts between religious liberty and LGBT rights or school choice or things that really capture the public imagination. But on the ground, for pastors, for people who run faith-based charities, for people who run Christian schools, other religious schools, this is a very important law. So Congress in 2000 passed this law. It's got a cumbersome name, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Basically what was happening is Congress was trying to deal with religious liberty writ large, and what ended up happening is they could agree on protections for land use, and then Chuck Colson came in and said, hey, what about people in prisons? We can't leave them behind. And he made a convincing case that we needed to protect the religious liberty of prisoners, and that was something that the right and the left could get behind, and that passed too. But everything else fell by the wayside. But they were able to pass these two things. Don't want to get too much detail in the background, but minority religious groups were disproportionately affected. Christian churches with minority memberships, African Americans, Asian Americans, were disproportionately affected by land use disputes, having trouble getting their permits made. And then they found that more broadly, places of worship as a category were being discriminated against. They would allow in a Mason lodge, but not a church. They would allow in a union hall, but not a church. Movie theaters and yoga studios in a commercial area, but a church that wanted to be in a commercial area, they were shut out, even though they, like those studios or dance studios, would have people coming and going at different times and sometimes be empty and sometimes be full, which is really what the government should be caring about, right, is the externalities of a building. But yet they were saying, no, churches aren't allowed, but these other places are. So Congress passed this law, and they empowered the Department of Justice to bring suit. So you can bring a suit on your own, hire your own attorney, or get one of these, like Advocates for Faith and Freedom, to represent you, or you can get DOJ, and sometimes both. So we'll come into cases where someone already has an attorney, and we think it's an important case, and we'll file our own suit. So land use, it covers zoning and landmarking law. Just going to put these up so you can keep that in the back of your mind. It doesn't cover everything to do with land. So building permits, it may be that you have to have a paved driveway, and that's under the building code. You say, hey, I'd rather have the money for ministry. That's not going to fall within this law. It has to do with use, how you're going to use. Are you going to use the land as a church, or are you going to use it as a school or other things? 5 types of cases. I won't read through them now because we're going to go through them with some photos in a second. So substantial burden. If something's a substantial burden on your religious exercise, you might be covered. If religious institutions are treated unequally with non-religious institutions, you might be covered. Discrimination. If they allow Jews but not Muslims, you might have a case. And we often have cases where they will allow Jews, but they don't like Orthodox Jews. Or they like Christians, but they don't like Pentecostals, right? So, and then total exclusion, which is where they completely eliminate places of worship from a jurisdiction, or unreasonable exclusions, where things are just so stacked against places of worship that in general, you can say that there's no fair shake for places of worship. So what's a substantial burden under RLUIPA? It's more than an inconvenience. Inconvenience is not enough. It looks at all the facts and looks holistically at them. Here's an example of not a place of worship, but a religious use. This is a Shabbos house. This is a house next to a hospital. That's actually a professional building, and the hospital's kind of over here. But where Jewish people who are Sabbath observant could stay on the Sabbath. So they visit relatives, and then they can stay in the Shabbos house. Well, the only hotel that you could go to is 1.7 miles away down a highway with no sidewalk. And for elderly folks in the winter, especially in Connecticut, there's snow. I think there's even some snow on the ground there. You probably don't see that much in California, but there it is. That's a burden on them. And the town said, oh, no, you're a boarding house. You're like a motel. You're not zoned for a motel. It's like, no, it's a little house. There are people with houses all over. We're just using it for a few people to come in for free and stay. And we ended up winning that case. Here's an example of a mosque that in Minnesota. This is how they showed substantial burden. I mean, they were in this, they had inadequate parking. Often governments say, hey, there's not enough parking. They say, yeah, we don't have enough parking. We want to buy a new place that has lots of parking. They were crammed in there. They couldn't see the prayer leader, the imam. And they bought this building, and they wanted to be in the basement of this building, had plenty of parking, and rent out the upper levels. And the town said no. And it was interesting because if any of you tried to locate churches, you had a residential zone, you had a light industrial zone separated by a highway, and then this building. And usually buildings like churches are great transition. I mean, these days, it used to be, I grew up in a neighborhood where there were churches and they were tucked in the neighborhood, and that's how everything is. Now, with planning, they try to get the churches kind of out of the neighborhoods, but it's a perfect transition between an industrial zone and a residential zone. The town still said, no, we don't want them there. We filed suit, and we ended up creating a settlement there to allow them to go. Unequal treatment. That's what I mentioned, where clubs, movie theaters, union halls, and so forth are allowed, but places of worship are not. Here's a church in Georgia that if it were any kind of assembly hall, really, it had a pretty wide definition, it would have been allowed to expand, but they were on 1.7 acres, and for a church you needed 2 acres, so they would not let this church expand. But we ended up, they backed down after we investigated the case. And that's worth noting too, is that we often, with these cases, just sending them a letter, having a DOJ investigation will get them to do the right thing. What did I miss? Oh, okay. So Hollywood, Florida, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just show you this one slide. So they wouldn't allow in this synagogue. The synagogue wanted to be on this busy street. There were plenty of other places of worship on the street with similar, in converted houses. But they would allow this, which was 2 houses that were connected, and they put in, can you see it? There's a playground. So it was a daycare. So you could have a daycare, you couldn't have a small synagogue. That's allowed, that wasn't. We said, no, that's crazy. This law protects them. If you're treating a daycare that way, you have to treat the church as well, or the synagogue as well. So you can't discriminate. That's pretty straightforward. Here is a case in Lilburn, Georgia. Little rundown house. They're using it as a mosque. They wanted to build a proper mosque, and the town said no because people packed the town meeting and rallied against them. We ended up winning the case, and this is a great quote because the founders of this mosque were from Pakistan, and they were Shia. And Shia in Pakistan face persecution. And he's like, we come to America, and we're facing the same thing, but then the federal government comes in and protects us. And they were really moved by that. He said the only country in the world that protects religious freedom. I mean, it's an exaggeration, but he was feeling good, so I'll give him that. An exclusion, so you can't totally or unreasonably exclude religious assemblies. United States v. Ben Salem, Pennsylvania. This was a case involving a mosque that we did, and it was very interesting because if you look at the orange, I want to get this right, the green are cemeteries, the orange are places of worship. What they did there for their zoning is said, okay, we know we have to have places of worship, but so the only place you can have places of worship are in institutional zones. So we're going to draw a circle around all our existing churches, and those are the orange zones, and those are where you can have churches. You can also have churches in blue are the government buildings, but they're not going anywhere, right? So those are the only zones where you're allowed to have churches. And so the only way that you could have a church or mosque or synagogue is if you bought land of somebody whose church was going under or a government building that was being abandoned. That never happens, right? Government doesn't like to give up things. And that would be the only way in which you could develop a new place of worship in the city of Ben Salem. We said, that's crazy. How are you going to do church planning there? How are you going to have new groups like mosques come in? So that's actually one of the interesting things is our 3 biggest areas of cases here are Muslims, Orthodox Jews, and evangelical Christians. You say, why those 3? Well, look who's moving and growing. You have a lot of other churches are they've got their established locations. The folks who are planting churches are more on the evangelical side, and so they're running into problems. The Orthodox Jews demographically are growing. Big families, people have kids young, so a lot of growth there. And then Muslims moving from sort of secondary migration. You first move to Michigan or New York, and then you move to looking for jobs, and people move to Georgia and Tennessee and so forth, and want to locate places of worship. And so you're seeing growth there, and then so you have that. Really, those 3 really make up the bulk of our cases that we bring under this statute. So there's some resources. We have a dedicated website on this law, RLUIPA, plus an initiative, the Place to Worship Initiative, where in addition to bringing more cases, we're also doing trainings around the country with U.S. attorneys' offices to educate folks on this, kind of like what I just did, but a little more detailed. And there's my info again, and then my assistant, Ryan Lee, is an attorney who runs the RLUIPA program.